All right, welcome to Intro to iOS Development Lecture 9, the final lecture, where we will be talking about Firebase. Just some quick logistics and reminders. Continue working on your final projects, which are due tomorrow, the 15th. There are no extensions for this project, and you must complete it in order to pass the class. There's also a new office hours sign-up sheet, so if you need some help, please put your name down. All right, so today we're going to be talking about what is Firebase, why we would want to use it, and then we'll be doing a live demo where we build a messaging app using Firebase and Google authentication. So, what is Firebase? Last week we learned about persistence, where we can store small amounts of data directly onto our device. But what if our app needs to interact with a lot more data that's, dynamic and changing? Well, that's where the idea of a backend comes in. Now, building and maintaining one, takes time. So what Firebase ultimately is an abstraction. It's a cloud-hosted service that allows you to simulate a backend where you can authenticate users, store a variety of things from images and audio to sheer data. That's a powerful tool, and it ultimately allows you to enhance your apps. So why would we want to use it? Well, it's a real-time database which is synchronized. That means all connected clients automatically receive updates instantaneously. This animation is like a visual representation of what's going on. And as I mentioned before, there's also third-party authentication, such as Google sign-in, Facebook login. There's a ton more, and you can also do a custom one as well. All right, let's get into the live demo. So the first thing we're going to want to do is actually make a Firebase project. So over here, this is the Firebase website, and you're going to begin by clicking Get Started. So we want to make a new project, so we're going to click Add Project, and we need to give it a name. So let's just call this Firebase Chat, since we are building a messaging app. You have to agree to some things, select a default account for Firebase, and then click Create Project. So Google is now allocating the space for our project. This might take a minute or so just give it some time. Okay, our project is ready. So as I mentioned before, we're configuring this for an iOS application. So we're going to click on the iOS icon to begin. The first thing it needs is our iOS bundle ID. That's that unique identifier in our Xcode project. So why don't we go over there? It's located in the general section right here. So we can just copy this in. Once again, we can give it a nickname. And then we're going to click Register. So what Firebase is going to give us now is a Google Service Info plist. This basically is a file that has all the necessary information for our project to communicate with Firebase. So let's download it. And we're going to plop it directly into our project. I'm going to put it in the supporting folder. Cool. So now we have our info plist within our project. So why don't we actually go through and see what our project does right now. Let's just run it. Wrong. Let's run on iPhone 11. So it's just a black screen. And that's because we haven't configured anything in our app delegate or scene delegate. All right, so in our app delegate, you'll notice that I've imported Google Sign-In and Firebase Authentication. Whenever you're using Firebase, the first thing you need to do is configure it within your Xcode project. And that's done by a one-line command. You basically access Firebase app, and then you just put configure. So that's set to go. Now, because we also want to have Google Sign-In and Google Authentication, we need to do some setting up for our GID sign-in, specifically the shared instance of that. So we have this thing called GID sign-in, and there's two things we need to do. First off, we need to make sure that we set the delegate to self. The other thing we need to do is actually properly set the client ID. So there's this field right here called client ID. Now we can actually access it by using what Firebase has. So once again, we're gonna go to Firebase app, and then I'm pretty sure it's .app like this, and then options, and then .client ID. Okay. Cool. So now it's saying that we haven't conformed to GID sign-in delegate, and the reason why is because I commented out our extension of that. So let's actually remove this and let it scream at us. And then down here, we're going to uncomment this. These are basically the functions needed to implement Google Sign-In. So we have basically our sign-in function and our sign-out function. At the start of both functions, we basically just make sure there's no error. And then what we're doing here is basically authorizing the user with their credentials, and we're using auth, which is a class provided by Firebase authentication. And we're basically just making sure that they can successfully sign in. And in the case where they want to sign out, we want to remove all chats and make the user nil. Now, system's actually a model that we made, so let's actually go through our models really quickly. We have this system model that has all the chats and the current user. We have a message model, or actually let's start with a chat model. So for every chat, there's a unique identifier for the chat. There's a friend that the chat involves, and then a list of messages. And then each message has an ID, a sender, a recipient, a body, whether it's been read or not by the recipient, and a timestamp. Okay, so with this, we've now implemented all the things for Google Sign-In, but we actually need to set up our window in Scene Delegate and do a couple more things. As with any project, we're going to make a window scene, so let's go ahead and do that. So the next thing we need to do is actually basically add this listener that's provided to us by Firebase. It's this add did state listener, and it basically checks for any single time there's a change in authentication by the user. And we're actually going to use this so we can properly prompt the correct view controller. We either want to show the login view controller or just the chats view controller. So let's make this let. That is going to be decided by a ternary operator. We're going to check whether the user is nil. If that is the case, then we want to show our login view controller. If that's not the case, then we want to show the chats view controller. Okay. And so now we're going to actually make the root view controller equal to this let. Since this listener detects every single time there's a change in authentication, we're actually going to want to assign our current user here. And so I have a function that basically parses the email just to return the thing before the @ So the way we get our email, this auth class provides it. So I think it's, and then we can just pass in the empty string, I think, because it's not guaranteed. Okay, so let's actually just make the window visible and set the window equal to itself, and let's just see what we have. So cool. We have our login screen. Actually, I just remembered something. We need to actually basically add a URL scheme to our project. The reverse client ID located in our Google Service Info plist we need to add this as a URL scheme. So the way we do that is by going to Firebase chat, going to info, and then in URL types, we're going to add that right there. And so that's actually going to allow Google sign-in to work. So let's rebuild this. And just let that go. Okay, so let's try to sign in. And we end up getting this 403 error. So it's actually expected. The reason why is because in our Firebase project, if we go to authentication, we haven't actually enabled Google sign-in as a sign-in method. So if we go over to the authentication tab, go to sign-in method, we'll see that Google is currently disabled. We want to enable it. So let's do that. Basically, we just need to provide a support email. Once we do that, we toggle to enable. And this now is set to go. So let's try that again. Cool, it works. And so if we put in a user, we get sent to the chats view controller, which is what we want. Now, while that works on the surface, there's actually a crucial piece that's missing. We haven't actually added in our user into our database. So we also have to set up our database. So why don't we do that right now? We click create database. We can just start in test mode. And we have to select a server location. This might take a minute. So as I mentioned before, we want to use the real-time database. So we're going to go over here and click real-time database. And yeah, there's nothing right now, even though we've technically signed in a user. So I want to actually just quickly explain how the data is formatted. It's not like a usual backend where it's like SQL tables. It's in this JSON format. So you sort of have like these parent and child like root nodes things going on. So we can have like a users branch, and then we can add in users. So like we can add in Omar and make his chats be equal. You need to give some like preliminary value if there's nothing else. So we can just make that true. And then for Yana, same thing. Now, obviously, this isn't great because we're just sort of adding in dummy data ourselves. We want to be able to generate it. So that's what we're going to do next. And just really quickly, for the purpose of this demo, we're going to set read and write to true so we can, change things and mutate things in our database. Obviously, in practice, this isn't a good thing, but for the purpose of this demo, that's what we will be doing. So now that that's done, let's go back to our project and actually be able to sign in a user. And let's get rid of this data. Okay. So the thing we need to do is actually basically have some way to communicate with our database. And so if we go to this Swift file right here called Database Manager, we have this sort of like we have a network manager in our other projects. This is basically this one Swift file where all our communications with our database will take place. So just to quickly go through some things, we have this URL variable, and basically it's getting the database URL from our Google Service Info plist. And then we have this reference variable that is of type database reference, that class. And we always need to use this variable if we want to have any interaction with our database. And that's really important. If you see these first three example functions that I've already implemented, you'll see that ref is used at the start of each one because it's the unique like identifier to this specific database. So I've made this function add user that basically checks whether there is a current user with our name. So, in practice, you'd probably want to use a unique identifier, but for the purpose of this demo, we're just going to use the user's name as like the key as to where they're stored. So we check whether the user is in the database. If they are not in the database, hence they are null, we actually want to add them. So we'll actually implement 4 functions, and you'll get a better idea of the different ways you interact with ref. So don't worry about this too much, but basically this just ensures that we actually save a user into the database. But we want to call this. So let's actually go back and to our scene delegate and actually populate our database. Okay, so we're going to use an if let just to make sure that the current user does exist. So we also want to make sure that the email that they have, that's a spelling error, that the email they have is not the empty string, because you actually need to you can't store that in the database. Firebase does not allow it. So if that check clears, then we want to add them to the database. So we're going to use our database manager and call that function add user. We know there's we know their name, and then they give us this completion. We're not actually going to do anything with it, so we can just default it. Have it return like that. Cool. So that's set to go. So why don't we run this? And first let me just sign out here. So let's do that. Okay, so let's sign in. And what we want to ultimately see is that a user has populated the database. So let's check our database, and hey, what do you know? A user is there. Ooh. It's MJS698 with the default, chats set equal to true. So that works. So why don't we, launch another phone and have another user sign in, because, since this is a chat app, we're going to have some kind of chat between two people. And there's the other user. So that's working now. So the next thing we want to do is actually, have users add each other within the app. So we have this add friend view controller right here, which basically is presented modally once you click this plus button. And we want to be able to search for them. So right now nothing happens. So we need to actually implement that functionality in Database Manager. So let's go over there. And we're going to scroll down to find users. We always need to use this ref variable. And as I mentioned before, you want to go down certain paths, right? And so in this case, we want to go down our users path and see users that match our query. So we're going to use this thing called queried ordered by key, since we store users by their name, that's the key value. And this next bit of code is just to sort of basically eliminate users that aren't close to your search. So don't worry about this too much. Query starting at and basically we want to observe this event. Now, you don't want to just use generic observe, because that will get called now every single time there's a change in our database. So we want to actually call observe single event right here. And so dot value basically just indicates anytime something changes within this single event. And then you have this completion. We're just going to call this snapshot. Okay. I'm just going to call this snapshot. Right, and then here. So we basically, since this is a JSON, since the database is JSON formatted, we need to actually make a dictionary of key value pairs from our snapshot. So every snapshot has this thing called value, which is basically a dictionary. So we need to make that as so. And so now what we're going to do is basically we want to get our users, that are in this dictionary. So we're going to use map. Oh. And we don't really care about the value. We just care about, like, since we store users by our key. Okay, the last thing we need to do is return our completion handler, and we just need to filter through our results and make sure we don't return like the current, like our own user, if that makes sense. So we're going to use filter, and we're basically just gonna in system, the model, there is a function called isNew, which basically just checks that the user isn't the same as the current user. So we can use the shorthand, $0 that basically represents each individual result through filter. And after that, we can return. So in the case where our user dictionary returns nothing, then we can just also return nothing in our completion. Just an empty list. Cool. So this should work. So let's build this on this phone and see if we're able to find the other user. Cool, they pop up. So the next thing we'd want to do is actually be able to add them and initiate a chat. So we need to implement the function add friend because we want to be able to click add and actually have that do something, because right now it does nothing. So let's go ahead and do that. So once again, we're going to be using ref, and this time we actually want to create a new branch in our JSON in our database, and we want it to be, we have users, but we also want to have chats. So we're basically, whenever you add a friend, you want to basically start a chat. So we're going to have this new child called chats, and we want, when you're storing data, you want some way to distinguish individual things. And so for our users, we're using their name, but we don't really have anything with chat. So we're going to use the thing called .child by auto ID. And it's basically, Firebase will just make a unique identifier for each individual chat. And so we want to actually do this thing called update child values. We actually want to insert something into our database. So that's what we're doing right here. And let me actually go back, because we want to use update child values with the completion handler, this one. Okay. So what do we want to do? We actually, every chat has messages, right? At the start, there's going to be no messages, so we just have to give a default sort of value of true. And then in here, so the first thing we're going to do is just make sure that, we don't actually have an error. So in the case where there is an error, we'll just return false, since our completion is going to be like a Boolean indicating whether we were successful or not. So like that. The next thing we want to do is actually, if we're going to make a chat, this chat's going to, be instantiated, but we want a way for users to know which chats they actually are, involved in. So we want to be able to access that unique identifier that we created in child by auto ID, and then store that in the user's chat, because every user initially has a chat right up here. So we want to actually insert this chat identifier into their chats. So we're going to do that by first getting that identifier. So we're going to have this thing called let chat ID, and we can actually get that ID by calling this reference within our completion. And I think you can go .key, and we just need to make it a string, so we can just force cast it for now. And so now we have that identifier. So there's some updates we want to do, right? We want to update for both the current user and the friend they're trying to add, that now they have a chat between them. So because everything's JSON formatted, we need to make a dictionary. And so we're just going to call this updates. And within here, so the first users will be the current users. So Oh my gosh. Cool. And we're going to force cast this just because we know the user would exist by this point. And then what are we going to set this equal to? So we're adding in a new chat, right? So it's going to be the chat ID, and then every chat has a friend, like this. And so we need to do that for the friend as well, from their perspective. I think I misspelled that. So well, let's just copy this. But as opposed to the current user, we want to store in the friend. And we have access to the friend based off of what they added. And instead of having the chat linked to them, we want to link it to the current user. Oh, and we need a separator. Okay, so now we want to actually update, our database with those values. So we're going to do update child values with updates. And then once again, we want to, just make sure there was no error when doing that. And now we don't need a reference anymore to the database. So we can just, once again, check if that was successful. If there was an error, we return false. In the case where there isn't, then we return, true. Okay. And maybe we don't need to force. Nope, not like that. Okay, cool. So now let's see if we can actually successfully add a user. So we clicked add, and now we've actually made a chat. And if we actually open our two users, they also have a chat linking one another. So MJS698 has Matthew Scullin and vice versa, and we also have a chat with right now no messages. So that is good. All right, so going to our code, there's one thing that I commented it out earlier on, and that's in chats view controller. We basically have this function getChats, which displays all the chat information. And so in database manager, there's this function. It's pretty complicated. We use this thing called a dispatch group to do multiple sort of, requests to our database. So don't worry about it too much, but it basically, updates that table view and chats view controller to display any chats. So since we uncommented that out, let's, update this on both iPhone 8 and on our iPhone 11. Yeah, so it already shows up there. And now we're going to do the same for the other one. And boom, there it goes. Great. So now we actually want to be able to send messages between people. Right now, there's no means to do that. We can type hello, but the send button isn't going to do anything. So let's actually go to that. So in our chat view controller, we have, where is it? We have this send button pressed, and basically we make sure that the message is not empty. And then if that's the case, we actually build our message struct and then send it into send message, which right now is not implemented. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so once again, we're using ref, and we want to, update the specific chats messages. So we need to go down the path of chats, but we actually want to, access this specific chat. So we need to use that chat ID, that unique identifier, and then we want to go down to its messages. And so with that, that's the correct path we want to go down. So we actually, want to add this message into the database, and we want to added in a way where we can still access it later. So we're going to give it a unique identifier. So child by auto ID. And so now we just want to actually update the child values. So, and in our message struct, we have this handy function for database that basically turns it into JSON format through a dictionary. So we can just call that. We just call that. So that should work. So let's try that. All right, so let's send a message. So let's see if it popped up in our database. And we can actually see that it did, right? We have a new message with our text and all the other things that we wanted to store. But it didn't actually show up. That's because we aren't actually listening for changes in our database. So Firebase is real time, but we actually need to be listening for events if we want to update our UI accordingly. So in Chat View Controller, we have this function that listens for messages right here. And we're going to actually implement that right now. In order to listen for messages, we need to access our ref variable. And what are we listening for? We're listening for changes in messages. So we need to go down that path of of chats, and then this specific chat. So chat ID. Oh, I'm forgetting a slash there. And then messages. So I mentioned before this thing of observe. Basically, we want to detect now any single time there's a change in messages down this path. So we don't want to use single event. We just want to use general observe, and value just indicates that it'll this will be called any single time there is a change, and we have this snapshot right here. And so what do we want to do? We well, once again, we need to decode the snapshot. So let's make a messages dictionary and set it equal to snapshot.value. And so if that is, and we also need to make it of type string any, like dictionary was. Oh, sorry, chat.id. Okay. So we want to actually populate our messages array for every single message in this dictionary. So we need to make a for each loop. All right, and so we have every message has an ID as its key. Every message is an object, or we can just call the value the message object. So what do we want to do with that? Well, okay, so we need to actually make a new message. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to use this function called from database, which basically is the opposite of for database. It decodes our our dictionary. So we're going to pass in the message object, and we need to make sure it's of type string to any, like this. And so what do we want to do? We also want to actually set the ID of that message, which is right now the key. So message.id is equal to message ID. And the last thing we want to do is actually append it to our messages array. Like that. Okay, so I actually need to initialize the cool. That should go away now. So what do we actually want to do? We want to sort these messages based off of their timestamp. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to go through and set or sort each of these messages We're going to actually use some shorthand notation once again. We're going to use the like $ ideas instead of having to come up with like a variable in our completion. So like that. Okay. So what about in the case where this, dictionary is nothing, and then we just set the chats equal to nothing? So self.chat messages equals the empty list. Okay. And I think that's all we need for now. The last thing we need to do is actually update our UI. So we're going to do dispatch.main async. And then in terms of what we're going to be doing, dispatch queue, sorry. Okay, so self.messages table view. We want to reload the data, and we also want to scroll to the bottom. So we have this function that basically just, takes the most recent message and brings that to the forefront. And we just want to do that when there are actual messages. So when messages is not empty. So when that's the case, then we actually want to scroll to bottom. Cool. So let's see if this works now. Wow. So it actually, shows up. And if we build this on the other phone, it should also work too. Cool. Okay, so the last thing we can do is update whether a user has read a message, because right now if we enter and come back, it's still unread. And we also want to have the idea that if I send a new message, so I send that in, I want this to, to update with the most recent message. Okay, so we need to implement update read. And so since we're using structs for messages, which are value types, we need to actually make a new variable, which is going to represent our new message. And we're going to set this equal to message and then change it to has read equals true. So now we actually want to insert this into the database. So once again, we're going to use ref, and we want to go down the path of chats to eventually access that specific message. So the way we're going to do that is by using our chat ID, and then, I always forget this, and then going down messages, and then finding that specific message ID. So like that. So we want to update the value. With new message .for database. Okay, and I mistyped that. That should be message.id. Okay, so let's see if that works. Let's run that on iPhone. They will need to run it on the other one actually, since the other one's receiving. Okay, so let's see if they open this message, whether the database gets updated. Okay, so it's still false because we actually haven't called update read. So we need to do that within our listener. So just to go through one more time, in chat we have this handy most recent message that returns the most, the last message. And since our messages are sorted, it is indeed the most recent message. And what we want to do is in chat view controller, we actually want to check if the recipient of the message is the current user. And if that is the case and they have not read it, then we should call update read. So we're actually going to have to use an if let to unwrap the most recent message in case it doesn't exist. Oh, whoops. Cool. And so if the most recent equals our current user, oh, we need to check, make that the recipient. If the recipient is our current system user, then, and if they had not read it, so then we actually want to call actually call update read with this message. So let's try that again. So if they click on it, let's see if something gets updated, and it does. Has read is now become true. So the last thing we need to do is actually make a listener on the chat's view controller, not only the chat view controller, so that if the other user sends a message, it actually updates in real time, because right now it doesn't. So it's pretty much the same code, luckily. So we can actually copy this for the most part, and then go to our listener in our chat's view controller. So for chat in system.chats, we can actually copy that code into there. We just need to remove the reference to self. Otherwise, everything should work. And then we need to actually update what we're not updating the messages table view, we're updating the chats table view. And there is no scroll to bottom property here. So this should work now. So let's run iPhone 11. And if this is the case, then we pretty much, achieved all functionality. And so now it updates. So please answer hi. So that's working. And now if we enter and then come back out, it's no longer bolded and it doesn't have the has read icon. So that's about it for the actual application. It's a pretty simple messaging app. There's a lot of things you could do in terms of removing chats that you don't want to be a part of anymore. You could send images and store like actual images using Firebase. So there's a lot of expansion and scalability with this project, but this was just sort of to introduce the like basics of using Firebase. So yeah, well, that's it for the live demo. Just some action items. Yeah, just keep working on your final projects. You guys have been putting in a lot of great work this semester, so just finish the year off strong. Yeah, thank you.